You might think today's politicians are out of control, but history has seen rulers so extreme, so bizarre, they make modern scandals look like bedtime stories. One name tops the list: Emperor Caligula. This man didn't just go mad with power. He turned madness into his brand. Caligula was the kind of ruler who could praise you at breakfast and feed you to lions by dinner. He turned the Roman Empire into his own twisted playground, where his wildest thoughts became law, and no one was safe, not even his own family. From making his horse a priest to talking to the moon, to declaring war on the sea, the things Caligula did weren't just strange, they were legendary. And the worst part? Almost all of it is true. If you think history is just a list of dates and battles, this video will change your mind. Caligula's story is full of drama, dark humor, and unbelievable behavior that even ancient historians struggle to explain. You'll learn what made a promising young emperor turn into a dangerous and unpredictable tyrant. And by the end of this video, you'll see why Caligula is remembered not for what he ruled, but for how shockingly weird his rule really was. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and prepare for a true story that sounds like fiction. You're about to meet the most outrageous emperor Rome ever had. 1. The child in the camp. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in 12 AD. He came from one of Rome's most powerful families. His father, Germanicus, was a famous and beloved Roman general. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus. As a child, Gaius traveled with his father during military campaigns. The soldiers adored him, partly because of the tiny military uniform he wore. They gave him the nickname Caligula, which means little boots, after the miniature army sandals, Caligula, that he wore. It was cute at the time, though he'd grow to hate the nickname as an adult. Even from a young age, Caligula was surrounded by both love and danger. His father died mysteriously. Many suspected he was poisoned by Emperor Tiberius, who saw him as a threat. After Germanicus's death, things got darker. Caligula's family faced exile, imprisonment, and death. His mother and 2 of his brothers were starved to death under Tiberius's orders. Somehow, Caligula survived. He lived for years under Tiberius's roof on the island of Capri, a place full of secrets, scandals, and perversions. There, he learned one very important lesson: never show your true thoughts and never trust anyone. By the time Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula had learned how to hide his rage and how to play the game of power. 2. The golden beginning. When Caligula became emperor at age 24, Rome celebrated like never before. People cheered in the streets. Prisons were emptied. Taxes were lowered. Games and festivals exploded across the empire. After the gloomy, paranoid reign of Tiberius, Caligula seemed like the dawn of a new day. For the first few months, Caligula did everything right. He honored his family, gave bonuses to soldiers, restored political order, and even worked with the Senate. He was charming, handsome, and confident. People adored him. But then, something went terribly wrong. 3. The illness that changed everything. Only a few months into his reign, Caligula became dangerously ill. Ancient writers suggest he may have had epilepsy, encephalitis, or been poisoned. Whatever it was, it nearly killed him. When he recovered, people were relieved. But something was different. The young emperor who had once smiled and made promises now wore a cold, blank stare. He no longer trusted anyone. He lashed out without reason, and his behavior began to spiral into madness. Many historians believe this illness caused brain damage. Others think the mask finally slipped, and the real Caligula came out. For he thought he was a living god. Caligula didn't just believe he was chosen by the gods. He believed he was a god. He told people he was Jupiter, the king of the gods. He had statues of gods changed to look like him. He walked around in golden robes and sometimes wore a lightning bolt, pretending to throw it at people who offended him. He ordered temples to be built in his honor and forced people to worship him. Even high-ranking senators had to kiss his feet and refer to him as a deity. The most shocking part? If someone refused, they often disappeared. 5. His horse had a better life than you. Caligula had a horse named Incitatus. But this wasn't just any horse. This horse had a marble stable, a house with furniture, servants to feed and care for it, a collar of precious jewels, an invitation to official dinners. Caligula loved Incitatus so much that he reportedly made him a priest, and threatened to make him a senator. Why? Some think it was a joke to mock the Senate. Others believe he was serious. Either way, it says a lot about how little he respected the people around him. 6. He held conversations with the moon. You probably heard of people talking to their pets or even to themselves, but Caligula talked to the moon regularly. At night, he'd walk around the palace, looking up at the sky, whispering and sometimes shouting at the moon. He believed it was the goddess Luna coming to visit him. Guards said he would even pause in mid-conversation with humans, tilt his head toward the sky, and begin muttering. Some say this was part of his delusion that he was a god himself, speaking with his divine family. Others thought he was losing his grip on reality, if he ever had it to begin with. 7. He turned his palace into a temple for himself. Caligula transformed parts of his palace into an actual temple, with one major difference. The temple wasn't for a god like Jupiter or Mars. It was for himself. In this temple, his statue stood beside the other gods. He had priests assigned to him. Daily sacrifices were made in his name. He even forced people to bring offerings of money, food, and animals, as if he were a god ruling not just Rome, but heaven too. In fact, some visitors from distant provinces didn't know if they were visiting an emperor or worshiping a god. Caligula liked that confusion. He thrived on it. 8. He cross-dressed and made the Senate watch. Caligula loved shocking people. He would walk into court dressed in elaborate women's dresses, wearing makeup and jewelry. On some days, he dressed as Roman goddesses, Venus, Diana, or Ceres. Then he'd order the Senate to attend meetings while he pranced around like he was the Queen of Rome. Sometimes, he forced senators to dress up with him, and they had no choice. Saying no meant death, or worse, public humiliation. For Caligula, power meant control over everything. Not just laws or armies, but even how people dressed, looked, and acted. If he wanted the Senate to play dress-up, they played along. 9. He was obsessed with his sisters. One of the most disturbing parts of Caligula's story is his obsession with his sisters, especially his sister Drusilla. He treated Drusilla like a wife. They were seen holding hands in public, sharing private chambers, and whispering to each other constantly. Ancient writers suggest he may have had sexual relationships with all 3 of his sisters. When Drusilla died of illness in 38 AD, Caligula was heartbroken. He declared her a goddess. He held a massive funeral, declared national mourning, and passed a law that anyone laughing or smiling during this time could be killed. This obsession went far beyond grief. It was one of many signs of his unstable and inappropriate behavior. 10. He replaced senators with random people. Caligula grew to despise the Roman Senate. He didn't see them as allies or advisors. He saw them as puppets, and he treated them like jokes. He started replacing senators with actors, slaves, and even gladiators. If someone made him laugh or performed well at a party, they could find themselves in the Senate the next day. He once made a man a senator because the man had fallen asleep during one of Caligula's speeches. Caligula found it hilarious and saw it as a sign of honesty. Of course, the real senators were humiliated, but speaking out was dangerous. 11. He made rich people write him into their wills. Caligula had a dark trick for getting rich. He would invite wealthy Roman citizens to dinner, flatter them, and make friendly conversation. Then, without warning, he'd accuse them of treason, unless they agreed to write him into their will. Often giving him everything, they faced prison or death. If someone was especially rich, Caligula didn't wait for them to die. He had them executed and took the inheritance immediately. One rich man was so terrified he accidentally fell on his sword in front of Caligula just to avoid a worse fate. Caligula reportedly laughed and said, "Now that's a generous donation." 12. Caligula versus the sea. This is one of the most famous and strangest moments in Caligula's reign. After some of his troops refused to cross the English Channel to invade Britain, Caligula was furious. Instead of punishing the troops, he took revenge on the ocean. He ordered his soldiers to line up at the shoreline and attack the waves with their swords. Yes, really, they were told to stab the sea. Then he made them collect seashells and bring them back to Rome as spoils of war. He even declared that they had won the battle and had conquered Neptune, god of the sea. Even the soldiers were stunned, but no one dared question him. 13. He built floating palaces. Caligula didn't just want luxury. He wanted floating luxury. On Lake Nemi, he had enormous ships built, but these weren't just boats. They were floating palaces. Think golden ceiling, mosaic floors, fountains, running water systems, and even heating. One ship had a full garden. Another had a temple on board. Why? So Caligula could party in the middle of a lake. These ships were incredibly expensive, and while ordinary people struggled to eat, Caligula floated above them, literally, surrounded by dancers, musicians, and luxury. The ships were lost for centuries, until archaeologists discovered them at the bottom of the lake in the 20th century. 14. He used executions as entertainment. Roman emperors were no strangers to violence, but Caligula treated killing like a game. He'd have prisoners executed during banquets for entertainment. Sometimes he'd point to a guest and say, "You're boring me. Feed someone to the lions." He liked to watch people suffer. He once ordered a man to be tortured for days because the man insulted a statue of Caligula's mother. Once, when a theater crowd got bored and started leaving early, Caligula ordered the gates closed. Then he randomly chose people to be dragged out and killed, just to send a message. If he was bored, someone had to pay. 15. He claimed to control life and death. In the final month of his reign, Caligula spoke constantly about being a master of life and death. He believed he had the right to decide who lived and who died, not because of law or justice, but because he was God. He once said, "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me." And he lived by that. He randomly pardoned criminals or sentenced innocents to death, depending on his mood. People in Rome lived in constant fear, because no one knew what might trigger his wrath. One senator wrote that Rome had lost its soul under Caligula. 16. Random cruelty became the norm. By this point, Rome had stopped pretending everything was fine. Caligula's behavior had become so unpredictable that people feared even being near him. He once executed a man simply for looking better dressed than him at a party. Another was killed for referring to Caligula as the greatest of all men. Because Caligula said he was more than a man, he was a god, and it was an insult to compare him to mortals. Even jokes could be fatal. A guard once made a small joke about Caligula's receding hairline. The next day, he was gone. Some people were punished just for dreaming about Caligula's death. The emperor had spies and informers everywhere, and no one could feel safe. 17. The empire started to crack. The Roman Empire was strong, but even it had limits. While Caligula partied, plotted, and punished anyone who crossed him, Rome began to feel the strain. The treasury was running dry. The people were restless. Provinces on the edge of the empire sensed weakness and started stirring. But no one could remove Caligula. Not legally. As emperor and self-declared god, he was above the law. And so the whispers began. 18. The plot to kill Caligula. Caligula thought he was untouchable, but behind palace walls, a quiet rebellion was forming. One of his own guards, a man named Cassius Chaerea, had had enough. Caligula had mocked him repeatedly, calling him weak, womanly, and useless. Chaerea, a battle-hardened veteran, took it personally. He gathered a small group of fellow guards. They didn't need an army, just a moment. That moment came on January 24th, 41 AD. 19, the assassination. It happened quickly. Caligula was walking through a hallway beneath the palace after attending a series of performances. Chaerea and his men approached him calmly. Then, without warning, they pulled out their daggers and stabbed him again and again. Some say he was stabbed over 30 times. Others say more. Caligula fell not as a god, but as a man. A mortal man whose own bodyguards ended his terrifying reign. His wife and daughter were also killed. The conspirators wanted to erase his bloodline completely, fearing a loyalist uprising. 20. Rome reacts. When the news broke, the people of Rome didn't mourn. They celebrated. Citizens filled the streets. Senators came out of hiding. Slaves rejoiced. Even nobles breathed a sigh of relief. The spell was broken. The monster was dead. But there was one problem. Rome had no emperor now, and chaos isn't far behind power vacuums. Eventually, the guards found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. He had always been considered slow and weak. But they needed an emperor, and Claudius, shaken and trembling, was crowned that very day. 21, Caligula's legacy. So what was left behind? Buildings, temples, floating ships, but mostly fear. And stories. Lots of stories. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded his strange behavior in vivid detail. While some stories may have been exaggerated, the core truth remains. Caligula ruled through terror, chaos, and ego. His name became a warning. A lesson about what happens when one person has too much unchecked power. Even today, thousands of years later, his story is told as a case study in how absolute power can break a person and a nation. So, what do we make of Caligula? After everything we've covered, from him declaring himself a god, to dressing as a goddess, to having conversations with the moon, and waging war against the sea, you'd think he was just a cartoon villain, a character made up to shock people, a joke from a dark comedy. But that's what makes Caligula's story so disturbing. It was real. This man ruled one of the most powerful empires in human history. He wasn't some side character in a forgotten kingdom. He sat on the Roman throne. He gave orders that shaped lives across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. His word was law. His whims decided life or death. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Because Caligula wasn't just strange. He was a case study in how power, when left unchecked, can twist even the most promising person into a monster. Let's rewind for a moment. When Caligula first took power, people loved him. They saw him as a new hope after the paranoid, cold rule of Tiberius. He gave bonuses to soldiers, released political prisoners, and even held grand games and festivals. For a while, it seemed like Rome had finally caught a break. Then came the illness. Whatever happened to his brain during that sickness, whether it was physical, psychological, or emotional, it lit a fuse. And that fuse led to an explosion of bizarre, dangerous behavior that shook the empire to its core. Caligula began to see himself as untouchable, divine, and above all rules. He didn't just bend the law. He was the law. And when a ruler believes that, when there's no one left to say no, that's when things go off the rails. It's tempting to laugh at some of the stories, like the Horsewood Palace or the soldiers attacking the ocean. But behind those stories is something much darker. Each strange act Caligula committed wasn't just for fun. It was a display of dominance. It was about power, control, humiliation. When he forced senators to dress up in women's clothes, it wasn't just a joke. It was a way to remind them that they were beneath him. When he executed people for small mistakes or random reasons, it wasn't just cruelty. It was to create fear so deep that no one would ever feel safe. When he made people worship him as a god, it wasn't about religion. It was about feeding an ego that had grown so big it no longer saw the difference between man and God. Caligula ruled through confusion, fear, and spectacle. And that, perhaps, was the biggest danger. Because when a society stops knowing what's real and what's theater, when laws bend to fit one man's feelings, when leaders become performers instead of protectors, that's when things fall apart. And in many ways, they did. Rome survived Caligula. Barely. But the cracks he left in the system echoed long after his death. His 4-year reign reminded the empire and the world that power must have limits, that even emperors need rules, that a crown doesn't make someone wise, and that the most dangerous leader isn't always the loudest or the angriest. It's the one who wraps madness in charm, in wealth, and in gold. It's easy to dismiss Caligula as just the crazy one, but maybe there's something deeper we should learn. Maybe his story is a warning about what happens when someone grows up in a world of betrayal, loss, and power games, and is handed control over millions of people before they even fully understand themselves. A warning about how easy it is for a crowd to cheer a leader into power, only to regret it months later, when that leader stops pretending to care. A warning that societies built on fear will always be unstable, because fear works until the day it doesn't, and then everything collapses. And maybe, just maybe, it's also a reminder That behind every strange headline or shocking story from history, there are real people, real victims, real consequences. The Roman citizens who lived under Caligula didn't see his story as entertainment. They lived in fear. They lost friends, family, safety. Their lives were shaped by the choices of a man who talked to the moon and believed his blood was divine. To them, he wasn't fascinating. He was terrifying. And that's why we still talk about him today. Because the story of Caligula isn't just a Roman tragedy. It's a human one. It's what happens when the worst parts of power go unchecked. When a leader stops serving and starts demanding. When respect turns to worship and worship turns to fear. So as we close the chapter on Caligula's wild, weird, and brutal reign, let's not just remember the madness. Let's remember the message. No matter how much power someone has, no matter how popular they are, no matter how rich, royal, or divine they claim to be, they are still human. And humans need limits. Because when we forget that, when we let one person stand above the rest with no one to challenge them, we don't just risk bad leadership. We risk repeating history. And if Caligula's story teaches us anything, it's that history doesn't always come back in the same way. But it does come back when we stop paying attention. Thanks for sticking around for this wild ride to one of the most unforgettable and unbelievable chapters in Roman history. If this made you think, made you laugh, or made you go, wait, what? Do us a favor, subscribe, like, and share. There's more where this came from. History isn't just the past. It's the mirror we hold up to the present. See you in the next one.